Searching, finding all the things we knew were hiding. And this revelation only opens up more questions.
Hello everyone, welcome to From Nowhere to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a graduate student in education, and with me is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. While the king of the gods may steal the limelight, oftentimes in myth, there is a goddess with even greater abilities. A reoccurring trope is the goddess who is more clever, magical, or involved than the king god. In this episode, we'll look at some of the stories surrounding these goddesses and think about what they have to say to us today. So we did the King of the Gods a couple weeks ago, right?
Yeah.
And one thing that became immediately evident is that many mythologies are very patriarchal in nature. There's definitely, you have the King of the Gods, he's a male. And, a reason we're not doing Queen of the Gods, I looked into that sort of thing is because Queen of the Gods generally kind of fits into that patriarchal stereotype.
Yeah,
so,
often.
Queen gods or earth goddesses are generally kind of a fertility-based sort of thing. And, it's
consorts,
very secondary.
Wives,
Right.
Yeah.
And so, a couple, really the ones out of the ones we'll talk about today, Isis is really probably the only one that can be considered a queen of the gods. Saga, if you were considering her kind of a aspect
I love her
of,
name, isn't it?
Yeah.
If
you're considering an aspect of Frigg, she might be considered one as well.
Mm-hmm.
But really, most of them are not the queen of the gods. They're a separate entity. So that's why we chose goddesses of wisdom instead of queens of the gods.
Mm-hmm.
But that's really not a slight to them at all either, because in many of these stories, these goddesses
are more powerful in some ways and more influential.
Yeah, there's a lot of stories where they end up tricking the king of the gods because they're more clever, or end up saving them or defeating them or doing any number of things that make you say, oh, well,
knowledge is power.
Right. So, another thing that sticks out about them is that they have a lot of different abilities. None of them are just goddesses of wisdom. They also have
a portfolio of what they're goddesses of.
Yeah. And in the case of Isis, Isis is she's a goddess of magic, but really you look at it, she has an innumerable amount of powers where you almost look at them and you think, well, what does Ra do then? She does all this, and obviously, Athena is the goddess of warfare as well as wisdom. So there's quite a diverse.
What's one fascinating thing to me about one of the fascinating things about Athena is, if you're an education person, I'm an education person. You listen to that list. And she's the goddess of the things you said. She's the goddess of mathematics. She's the goddess of the arts. She's the goddess of wisdom. But hear what we just said. Mathematics and the arts, they are equal and balanced, and both are required to be the goddess of wisdom. And so that just in that list, you have this remarkable lesson offered subtly about education.
Yeah, because back in that day, it was in order to be considered a wise person, you had to be kind of a polymath or a Renaissance type person. It wasn't enough to be a good mathematician. If you were just a good mathematician, you weren't necessarily wise. Or if you were good, you look at philosophers, painters, these sorts of things. if they weren't just those things, a lot of these guys,
Right.
we're measuring the circumference of the earth or doing,
Yeah.
doing other stuff as well as, painting and whatnot. So there wasn't really this neatly drawn line between the humanities and the STEM fields back then. There was, you had to be good at both in order to be considered wise.
Yes.
Obviously, there was a much smaller body of knowledge back then compared to now. But
Well,
that
being
doesn't
wise-
necessarily invalidate the premise.
No, it doesn't at all, because seeking wisdom through multiple paths of study doesn't mean that you know everything about that field. And so you're right in pointing that out. It is not about being perfect at, or I think that's what these characteristics teach us. It's not about the end point. If your God is of art, that doesn't mean you're going to make all art. That doesn't mean you're in charge of all art. It means that you're a pinnacle point saying art is important. I think.
Yeah.
And so, it's not about the final exam.
So let's dive in then. We'll start with Athena, because she probably is the most well known.
Yeah.
Why don't you give us a little bit of Athena's story?
I love Athena's story because she's a pain to her dad. So Athena is, we know that she's born from, he has a large migraine, which is really his daughter coming out of his head, fully armored. Just that image is just amazing. This fully fledged being pops out of his head. And the reason that had to happen is because
He's a scoundrel.
he's a scoundrel like his father. Well, you know the story. So what do you find fascinating about her conception?
It's basically the retelling of Cronus and the Titans. So with Cronus, he has these children, and each child he eats so that they can't usurp his power, right? And then he ends up getting tricked and swallows a stone instead of Zeus, and then Zeus comes back and takes power from him.
Right.
Well, in the Athena story, Zeus does the same thing, right? He starts
With Metis.
right. He goes around philandering and eating these children, and then eventually he ends up eating.
It's Metis.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And so
Metis herself was a being of great power. She's a being of craftiness and intelligence.
And so the story was that if he had children with her, they would be more clever than him. And that's what made him nervous. So he eats her, but she's already pregnant with Athena. And so Athena is born from Zeus's.
He has a
sword.
terrible headache, and suddenly there she is popping out of his head. But of course, he's a god, so that can happen.
Right.
A lot of the tales indicate that she was his favorite, which is really interesting.
That's a funny turn of events.
It's a funny turn of events, but she also becomes. She's not his tool. He sends her. She's sort of his mercenary in some ways, but she challenges him in others. She refuses sometimes. She's called Pallas Athena. Pallas means girl, but she's not a girl. she's a powerful woman, and more. And so that's why she's fascinating. She's goddess of the city. She's as we said, craft and wisdom, rationality. Well, here's a symbol of somebody who comes popping full blown out of your head. So of course, it's not a rational story, but it is about thought that is armored. And armored thought is not thought that is unable to let other thought in. We were conversing before the show about things. A wall around your mind does not allow you to be wise. So armor is not a wall. No armor is impenetrable, but armor does allow you to go places where you might not otherwise go.
Right.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there's definitely an interesting juxtaposition between some of the roles of the gods and goddesses from back then and kind of our views of gender stereotypes today, right?
Yes.
Many of the kings of the gods are associated with very abstract kind of feelings, whereas a lot of these goddesses of wisdom are about concrete action, which,
Yeah.
That's,
That's a really good point. Like example in point, rather. She invents the flute. She's not just goddess of music. She creates instruments. She doesn't play the flute. Why? Because she doesn't like the way it makes her cheeks look when she has to puff into it, the embouchure thing.
Right.
I just find that an incredibly marvelously human. It's not human in the sense of the flawed humanity of the warriors in the Odyssey and so on. It's the human. I made this. I don't like the way it makes me look, so I'm not going to touch. I'm going to want to make something else. Gods are vain,
right? Yeah, and so I mean, other things that are kind of interesting about Athena is we talked about how Zeus tried to sort of foil her birth because she was going to be more clever than him, but she was also going to be very powerful. And I mean, one of the stories she defeats Poseidon, who is
Zeus's brother.
Zeus's brother, yeah. So very powerful. And again, we're comparing and contrasting. I just talked about how these goddesses of wisdom in general are more concrete and actionable than the kings of the gods, but within their stories, there's some differences too. We talked about how Athena's sort of vain or sort of powerful, and then we'll get down and Isis is kind of more of a compassionate goddess. So there's different personalities. It's not like they're carbon copies of each other across different cultures. They're very different.
I mean, Athena, to me, at her worst, and there's a marvelous play about this story about her, but we know the story of Medusa, we think, and Medusa is a gorgon. She's been rendered into a monster that turns people into stone. They have snakes for hair, but she's that way because she was there's no kind word for it. She was raped in a temple of Athena, and when she asks Athena for help, Athena says, "How dare you have committed this act in my temple?" And she punishes her by turning her into this creature. So at her worst, she is an ultimate example of the patriarchy, of female shaming, in the worst possible way, not caring for women. So she's a formidable, not gentle and nice creature.
Yeah, which, I mean, again, this brings up an important point about kind of general gender roles and stereotypes.
Yeah.
We have this idea that, up until the year 2000, women were homemakers and mothers, and men were, workers and these other things. But really, these sorts of things have exist all throughout time. Athena is very much a tomboy, essentially. I mean, she's the patron of heroes. She goes around armored. She bullies some people, and she defends other things, and she's defeating, Poseidon and doing all this stuff. So she, very, very obviously does not fit your typical female gender roles.
No. And that's not why we would look. That's not what makes her. And what makes her interesting is the fact that she doesn't.
Right, exactly.
But she is also. I mean, if I just think into our own moment now historically, I mean, it's Athena is the goddess of the established patriarchal law and order. You don't challenge that. Mm-hmm. She would not be a kind goddess right now.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, it really just highlights, some of our, our misthinking about how things like this were done in history.
Yeah.
And I was reading a study this past week actually talking about how the differences intra-gender differences are far greater than intergender differences. You'll find much greater difference between men or women than you will find between men and women, Mm-hmm. And you find that looking at a lot of the stories of these gods is that, just because they're a goddess does not mean that they're going to completely conform to
any particular. Yeah, right. Exactly. There's not a limit. You're right about that. Not a limit.
So we've talked a little bit about the kind of that powerful or warlike aspect of Athena, but she was a goddess of wisdom. And you look at the Odyssey, and she is very much a counselor to Odysseus in that story. So yeah, like I said, goddess of mathematics. Very very wide,
and sewing and cooking too.
Yeah.
just tossed in. It's like that always feels to me, but I know it's not, but it feels like this little tacked on addendum. Oh yeah, she's female. She has to do with it. I can't see Athena preparing them in the stories. No, I it's like there was an old TV show called Bewitched where you could wiggle your nose. Full-fledged feast, and maybe. Anyway.
All right, so let's move on. The second one we were going to look at was Saga, who was the Norse goddess of wisdom. And there's some question about whether she is kind of an aspect of Frigg, who would be the queen of the Norse gods. What do you think about that?
Well, there's not as much accessible information or storytelling about her in English that I have experienced. Mentions and allusions to. I have trouble with calling any character, and this is just the literary part of me, an aspect of somebody else's character. So, if Frigg or Frigga or Freya, if she has as partly her work is wisdom, then let it be like the Greeks in that way. To say, well, the Saga, and I know I've read those same things. It troubles me because her very name is associated with storytelling. As much as to say that wisdom can be found in narrative, that doesn't need to be tacked on to any other goddess's portfolio for me.
Yeah, and again, a lot of these goddesses that we'll look at, they have a laundry list of characteristics that go along with them. Saga is a little bit different because there isn't a whole lot of literature to go with her. No. But what there is pretty important, right? Because, like you said, the name itself, the word, when we use the word saga now, we're talking about a long story. Yeah. That is kind of was her role. She was kind of the Asgardian historian. Well, why don't you tell what we do know about her?
Well, we know mostly in my, and you may have found other things, but in my reading, it's mostly what's associated with her. Where she differs from, as you've said, where she differs from Athena, I think markedly, is that she's known for kindness. Well, I think that's also a patriarchal aspect. Well, Odin is wise. Odin sells his eye or gives his eye up and so on, hangs himself by his foot for days from a tree in order to gain knowledge. I don't know how Saga gains knowledge. I don't know that story. But I can't imagine her knowledge is any less important. But femininity is directly associated with her in the Norse battle culture. And so she's also associated with prophecy. Athena, not so much, not so oracular. So a saga means seer. It also is a word that becomes narrative and storytelling. But even in that, seer, she sees things to tell other people in order for them to go out and do what they're going to do. So it's an active role in sharing knowledge, but it's not an active role in like leading a battle the way Athena does. I don't have any experience of any story where she does that.
Right.
It's more being consulted quietly.
Yeah. It's a very different story than from Athena, and I really like it because it's kind of it seems very mystical, right? I feel like, again, very limited literature, but I feel like what the Norse are sort of trying to convey is that Saga has a much deeper, more intrinsic relationship with knowledge or wisdom than Odin, I think. Because,
yes,
like I said, Odin has to fight and sacrifice for knowledge.
And he depends on those two ravens, we've said this before, to bring him information.
Right. Whereas Saga
watches.
Right. Saga the implication almost seems like she lives outside of time. She's the historian. She knows everything that's happened in the past. She's a seer. She knows what happens in the future. She does not actively participate. She's almost like a god of time, sort of. She has these sort of roles.
Yeah.
And but again, it's more passive than Athena. She's not going and burning things down. Odin's just coming. Hey, let's hang out. Let's drink. Hang out on the beach. And I'm going to tell you about what happened in the past and what happened in the future.
Yeah. There's a Marvel Comics character that she reminds me of. This is maybe obscure information now, but it's a character who's been all the way through the canon of Marvel, and it's called the Watcher. There's a whole group of aliens, but the Watcher. That's like not the same thing as the Seer, but it's close. If you're very keenly with acuity and discernment observing what's going on, which suggests an open-mindedness, it suggests a taking in of what is there, not having it be spun. That's great power.
Yeah. She is very unique in Norse mythology. Because like you said, Norse mythology it's a battle culture, And I think that to me, it seems like it's rife with symbolism. The fact that she's sitting on a bank, there's a flowing water on a beach. The fact that it's sort of a passive thing. She's a historian and a seer. There's really heavy symbolism with this aspect of time.
I agree. I think that's a great place to go with this. Yeah.
And not even just the flowing of time, but sort of the passive aspect of it. That question of what things are within your control and what things aren't. Coming from a battle culture. If you're going to be fighting all the time, you're going to be doing all these things. How much is that going to be contributing to this flow of time?
Yes, and how much better are you at battle or fishing, which you have to do in order to survive in such a culture, to ply the waves, to do this business that you're doing. You have to be aware of the water, and she is a water and a flow, and how the water of time works for us thinking about this. But to read the currents of a very difficult part of the ocean, to be able to, she's referred to as a student of life or a student of the universe, which suggests a humility and a discipline and a focus. You're a lifelong student, and so am I. That says open-mindedness, that says take in what is there and then figure out what it means. Mostly take in what is there, process it. So, yeah, that's it. Yeah.
So we're seeing a huge jump between Athena and Saga.
Yeah.
And in a way, Saraswati, the Indian goddess of wisdom, has aspects of both of them, right?
Yes, and sometimes she's called Sarasvati. Many pronunciations, but yeah, she has. So we're going to the Indian.
Yeah, you're gonna have to help me with some of those pronunciations.
I will try.
I'm the kind of person who has read a lot of words, but has not heard a lot of them spoken. So pronunciation is not my strong point.
It does help. As I said, I had this marvelous professor named Tom Coburn who took a small seminar deeply into Hinduism, and so to hear him gently pronounce the names taught me a lot. This was back before you could go press a button, say sound how to pronounce and put it in the word, but you're not even sure of those because you're not sure where those are coming from sometimes. So
those are helpful. There's one the other day that Amanda and I we saw portmanteau. What? Okay. Well, we know that you blend two words, but like, how do you pronounce that? Is it? It looks French, but portmanteau. Okay.
Yeah.
So Sarasvati. Why don't you? And again, in the Indian is very.
Well, we talked about this last week.
Is an incredibly ancient religion
and complex.
Right. Very complex. Stories are changing, but what's kind of her general history?
When she first shows up in some of the sacred or storytelling texts, the Rig Veda, for instance, she shows up. It's sort of it's like what you said last week. We don't, even when we're talking about creation mythology and then the king of the gods, some of these beings are just there, right? And so she's first appearing there. Later, she's some religious texts. She gives gifts. One of her first gifts is ink, pen, writing, and thus eloquence. And thus study, so language. She gives the written language, Sanskrit.
And the fascinating part about that is, so do we? You know what time frame that was? When did you first show up?
Oh, thousands, of years. Okay, so, we're talking. You're talking probably well over 2,000 years, I think.
Right, so 2,000 years ago. In India today, they still celebrate her by children learning the alphabet, learning language, writing, Yeah. So it's amazing that over that length of time, it's been that consistent,
But she's a Brahma's wife. So they're all these domestic pieces about her. Like Athena, she is patron of both, and it suggests equally arts and sciences. There's that commonality. See, which writing, which is why she's one of my, of course, as a teacher of writing, but she's one of the ones that I find most fascinating, not because of any necessarily heroic deed, although there are things associated with it. We can talk about those in a minute, but because she brings the tools. It's sort of Promethean. Prometheus in the old Greek stories brings fire to the darkness of humanity. Well, she brings writing, which is its own kind of fire.
Right. Yeah.
So but you'll like this because of what we were talking about with Saga. She's associated with her name is, among other things, means flowing or has a suggestion of flowing. She's watery. She is associated with rivers, and well, rivers are deeply important in the culture. And the Ganges River, the sacredness of water. And let's see what else that I had this underlined somewhere. Musical instruments. And she is not, Brahma is not worshipped, really. But she has her own rituals. So this is one of those inversion things where wife of or consort of actually has more cultural power. So I think that's interesting about her. So here's a story. I think you read this one too, but one of the most important Hindu gods, Brahma, is rarely actively worshipped. This is explained as the result of a curse from Sarasvati. The curse was actually brought about through a misunderstanding. One day, when awaiting his wife to begin an important ceremony, and he unable to start the ritual punctually, Brahma asks the gods' advice. They respond by creating a new wife for him, Gayatri, so that the ceremony could go ahead at the precise time. When Sarasvati eventually turned up, she was not very pleased to see her husband with another woman, so she cursed Brahma never to be worshipped by humanity. Okay, so now interesting, because in yoga, a little side note, the Gayatri is one of the most fundamental mantras, chants, that helps one settle into meditation. So the discipline is there, but she was not happy.
That's a real interesting story, right? Because we talked about this a little last week. We were saying, if you were going to use mythology as a way of like teaching societal lessons, a lot of the kings of the gods were awful examples, right? Because they're very, they weren't good in that way. This one kind of is. You see rampant infidelity and philandering among kings of the gods, and generally it goes unpunished. But in this case, it kind of does, right? So,
or it's an indirect punishment. It's a punishment, as often, again, the patriarchal story. Hera with Zeus, she doesn't punish Zeus. She punishes the woman that Zeus is with.
Right.
Turns her into a cow, or renders her infertile, or banishes her. It's just, we're replete with those examples. But yeah, there's no direct punishment here. He
loses his status as a venerable deity,
a venerable character,
because he made that mistake.
Yeah.
That's the kind of lesson you'd want to reinforce in a society to actually maintain family, a nuclear family norm and ties. You'd think.
If you were taking it as a morality tale, I suppose so. I'm not sure it's intended that way.
Yeah, we talked about it last week. There's a difference between mythology and folklore, for sure.
Right, but it certainly does. I think if one stays with the mythological aspect, there's still there's a related thing, which is that. Well, this is my interpretation, which is that the power of language, of writing, of storytelling, of art is more important than punctuality. That's what I really take from it. You can bloody well wait for this ritual of yours to start till I get there. If you have to start punctually with the ritual rather than what the ritual itself is about, then you're missing the point. Male. And so, that's where I am with it.
Yeah. It definitely portrays that message of the meaning of something being more important than the form of it.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
it's an interesting one. What else? Do you have anything else on Sarasvati?
No, let's move on.
Okay.
There's so much, but no, let's move on.
Yeah, it's interesting. Again, one of the things I like about the Hindu and the Indian gods is the iconography of them. It's fascinating to look at them, and she's an interesting one because
sometimes forearm,
yeah,
sometimes
and,
holding a water pot and a pen,
right,
or a stylus, or something.
And a musical instrument. Which what's funny about is Sarasvati and the Japanese goddess of wisdom, again, Benzaiten. You see a lot of similarities between them. But yeah, so real interesting.
Yeah.
And again, Sarasvati is representative of real action. Actually music, speech, learning. These things that are more. I wouldn't say concrete. Music and learning and speech are all things that require thought and wisdom and abstraction. But they're the concrete, actionable manifestations of them.
Jumping right into your current field of study, they are actionable as CLOs or SLOs or any one of those unit planning things one does. You must have that active verb
that
indicates. So you can't use some abstract term. The students will learn X, Y, or Z. That's not allowed anymore. It's got, and so I think Sarasvati or Benzaiten is involved in that. It's their fault.
All right, let's go to Egypt. So we've made a lot of allusions to her so far, and she's probably might be the most interesting one to me out of the group is Isis.
Yeah.
The one true queen of the gods that we're talking about in this episode, and she's just unbelievably complex. There's so much to the story of her. Why don't you give us?
Well, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that because I like Seshat more.
Okay.
Than Isis. So I'm going to have you talk about Isis, and I'm going to talk about Seshat.
Okay.
And what you? I mean, I can. No, I'll talk with you about what is the most fascinating thing about Isis is her ability to take action.
Mm-hmm.
What's the most powerful thing that she's, or what's one of the most striking, dramatic things that she did in your? I mean, experience of the story.
Yeah, I think that the coolest aspect of her to me is how she helps people to the underworld, essentially.
Yeah.
And so we talked about Ra last time and about how he makes that daily journey.
Mm-hmm.
But Isis, with her, she's known as, she's spoken incredibly highly of. Like there's quotes in the Egyptian mythology that say she's more clever than thousands of gods, or she's more magical than all the gods, all of these things. So she's known for casting spells, for transferring people from life to death, which in Egyptian culture is extremely important. We have pyramids for that reason. The greatest, some of the greatest physical structures ever built are dedicated to this concept. So the fact that she's given that significance, and the way that she's talked about and her role in the mythology doing that, that's probably the most striking part to me.
Because she's not Charon or Charon from the Greeks. So you'll give a coin, they ferry you across. She's much more the guide. Yeah, okay. And she and her other aspects thus flow into a thing that was a Saturday morning cartoon show when I was a kid called Mighty Isis, which was a really low budget thing, but it was wonderful anyway because it was a female hero, and that was unusual,
right?
Yeah. So anyway, side note, I like Seshat because she is also a scribe. And she is considered the goddess of wisdom also in some parts of Egyptian mythology. So I'm not trying to sidetrack you away from Isis, but I think that here's where we have different aspects. Isis has in some ways, perhaps the knowledge through active experiential work, whereas if you're sitting on a beach and watching, like Saga, so to speak, studying the universe, that's not passive. Watching is passive. Seeing implies an activeness, but it's a different kind of activity than with Isis. So Sashad means female scribe, lady of writing. And she is the consort, not the wife, because of course it's still patriarchal, of Thoth, who's himself, he's the god of wisdom. But we've got a god and a goddess of wisdom, and in fact, more than one.
Right.
So why do we need this? Well, I don't know. To try to, we're not going to take that all apart in our podcast, but the question arises, why would more than one deity or figure be associated with this? Is it because wisdom and knowledge are so many different things? Now we're going back to Frigg,
Yeah.
and Saga as an aspect. Well, okay, so if Thoth is the male god of wisdom and Isis is the queen of the gods and wisdom is associated with her, but writing wisdom is Sashad, but Thoth needs her with him, then perhaps just having wisdom isn't enough. You have to be able to convey the wisdom.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you definitely see that across all of these characters, right? You know, again, Athena, you know, is the goddess of wisdom, but I think that in many ways that manifests as being clever or strategic, or, you know, so there's an actionable thing behind that. Saga is sort of the antithesis of that. And then you're seeing aspects of it in these characters. Like you said, Isis has some of both, I think, because, like you said, there's that actionable or strategic or cleverness that Athena has through experience, but there's also a very kind of mystical element to it. There's these spells, and there's this ability to get Ra to say his secret name, and all of this other stuff that is not tangible. It's very it's abstract, you know?
Yeah.
And so, again, we're looking at these characters and we're seeing that they're not just carbon copies of each other. They're very complex.
Right. And in her case, one of the reasons that I find her interesting is because she became, like Lilith in Christian mythology. She was sort of overwritten until she just almost disappears. She's one of the most ancient goddesses. And having unearthed her stories and her festivals and so on, there's this note that one of the sites that I was re-referencing, that other goddesses prospered, so we can't blame the patriarchy, this writer says. Sashad refused to fit into the new popular solar religion. And so she's written out of mythology because religion itself, mythological based religion, is changing. But yet she still surfaces because writing is so important. Plato was, none of this was, he wondered if writing was going to be the undoing of the world, but writing was very important for these folks. And I think about this. And I know this is a side thing too, but why do we talk about these things? Well, partly because for me they manifest in one's own life. Some of the most powerful women that I know, my friends, my deep lifelong friends, are people or daughter or daughter-in-law, or but people who are deeply involved in the arts in one way or the other. But well, that's self-selecting, I suppose. It's genetic and all that kind of stuff. But more than that, this is where I see elements of these beings, not friends as goddesses, but the aspects.
Mm-hmm.
Some who are very, very caught up in their very being in writing, some in visual art, some in storytelling through theater or puppetry and playwriting, and so you wouldn't have just one element, because some of them represent collectively to me, and we have the advantage of sitting here talking about all this, is the wisdom through seeing, the wisdom through strategy, the wisdom through taking action, and so on.
Yeah, and I mean, think about this, right? She's the goddess of writing, the scribe goddess. She's written out of history because she doesn't fit in with the solar gods, but she continues to live on through writing.
Mm-hmm.
So, obviously we're looking at these stories and, people are making their own determinations about what they believe in, right? But by and large, not many people today believe the Egyptian gods and goddesses are real. But think about that. You get written out of the pantheon, but you continue to live on historically through the gift that you are the patron of.
Yes.
There's something very real about that, isn't
there? Yes, it is. It can take you there, and I like the way you put that. It's well, this is why Joseph Campbell was spent his remarkable intellect and life and gathering tales, finding a common story, and so on. But also, how does that apply to us? What is the mythic in our life? Well, Jung was doing that. Mm-hmm. It's something that is there and accessible and not weird, although it might feel weird.
Yeah, that's and that's funny. Is that Jung is a good example, right? He has the archetypes and tried to apply psychology to these sorts of things, and again, to me, it's very much like mythology, right? Okay. Maybe there's a very questionable element of what about this is real. But that doesn't at all affect the interest in it. You read about it or you think about it and you go, there's something powerful about that narrative, that story, the power of just, regardless of the reality of it, the power of the narrative, the story that's being told.
And there's another little thing with her that's very important to me. Building on what you just said, building on that, writing, when she resurfaces and so on, this is an evolution of storying, but accounting. The most important writing is the listing of items and treasuries and how much beer you have or whatever they're drinking, right? The treasure. So it goes from writing to data acquisition, which is certainly what has happened to writing instruction in our and then a different kind of use of space. She becomes associated with architectural space. So the creation of space. You start with writing. In the beginning was the word. And then you're creating space. And you're enumerating what's in that space. So there's just a really, really ancient thing in there.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, the Egyptian and the Hindu pantheons, in a lot of ways, are the most interesting to me because they're so old. Like I was looking at an interactive map the other day. It's a video. And as the video goes on, every second is something like 100 years of history or something like that. And so it's showing the entire world and the different civilizations or dynasties that have ruled over different parts of the world. And one thing that you see that really sticks out is as this map changes, you constantly see these things pop up and disappear, pop up and disappear. Egypt and is always there at the Nile Delta. It never expands, it never contracts. It's just there for thousands and thousands of years. And that's an interesting thing, right?
It is.
Because the more things change, the more they stay the same, or vice versa. The more they stay the same, the more they change, right? The culture was there, and there wasn't a whole lot of inside or outside influence in the form of captivity or conquering different lands or, integrations of different societies or cultures, that sort of thing. But the culture itself was still changing over time, right?
Yes, it will. Yeah.
It's sort of an antithesis to America. Rather than being a melting pot, bringing in all of these elements and constantly creating something new, instead you had this one spot that occupied the same geographical region and had the same religion, but it was still constantly evolving and changing over time.
Yeah.
And it's a whole different perspective from a lot of the other places that you look at in terms of cultural appropriation and those sorts of things.
So anybody who happens to be listening to our podcast and saying, why are you talking about all these things? Well, it's not because everything has to have a utilitarian purpose, but you just demonstrated it metaphorically, linguistically, intellectually, spiritually, artistically, these stories lead us to observations, a seeing that leads us to rethinking what culture can be and how different cultures are of equal importance in our development as beings.
Yeah, man, it's fascinating. All right, so let's look at Benzaiten, our last goddess of wisdom. And again, like I said, we'll see a lot of similarities between her and Sarasvati.
Yeah.
But why don't we go over her general kind of background?
Well, I find I haven't had discussions with my Japanese students about this particular being. But sometimes we do talk about things. But I think what's interesting for me is that she is associated. This is like a team, right? We like teams in this culture, right? Well, so there's a team of 7 gods of fortune, or 7. It's like the Magnificent Seven. Right? So she's part of that. And again, like Sarasvati, like Athena. Now, here's one of those things that slips across cultures. The flute, the instrument. In these stories, there's an instrument that the goddess invents, but doesn't like the way it looks or sounds when she plays it.
What do you think is the message there? You have these goddesses of wisdom that are inventing musical instruments that don't want to play them. What is the underlying message?
Oh my gosh. There are a couple of thoughts that come to mind. One is the wisdom in knowing that you can conceive of things and still can't necessarily do them. Because God or goddess doesn't mean that you can do everything. To me, that's what's in there. So there's a kind of, again, a humility or a running into a boundary. Sure, I can do body fill on a car. I'm not the goddess of cars or the god of cars, but I can do body fill on a car, but I am not going to be able to play that process the way, Steve Odd or anybody else around the area that we live in are so good at because they spend a life honing it. You can have you ever made something where you just said, I've made it, now what?
Yeah. And again, I think you're bringing up an interesting point, right? Because a good example of that would be kind of expanded universes, right? So George Lucas writes these 3 movies, and then all of a sudden dozens of authors start writing their own stories. And in a lot of ways, people would say, these other authors actually created the universe, so it's kind of the same thing. All right, well, this guy created something that can perform a task. But really, and another guy. All right, so I love Fender guitars, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not supported by Fender guitars in any way, but anyway, so I love Fender guitars. Fender guitars were created by a guy named Leo Fender. All the iconic designs he invented: the Telecaster, the Stratocaster, the Jazzmaster, along with a bunch of other guitars under different brand names. Easily the most influential guitar maker of all time. Didn't play guitar. So he was the god of musical instruments. He did exactly what they did. He created these unbelievable things, but he never performed anything on them.
And was consulted, as I understand. I mean, you know more about him than I, but I've heard a few stories. I think he was sought as the wise one for guitars, right?
Yeah, because he worked at Fender, and then he worked at Music Man, and then he worked at G&L. So all these guitar companies were scrambling to get his
and asking him to make new, or he wanted to create new versions, right?
Yeah.
And presumably people were saying, well, how could I make this sound, or how could I make that sound? Yeah. So there you are.
Again, this,
that's
so that's a good example of the complexity of a topic, right?
Yeah.
And a certain concept or a certain abstraction isn't as simple as being the god of music, And she's also, if you're the god of music, you might not necessarily be the god of instruments or the god of, composition or
and there's the use of it when you start saying, what does it mean to be the god of music? Or what does it mean to be an inventor of guitars? What does that entail? What does that not have to entail? What does it surprisingly not involve? But there's the kernel of joy in it for me. It's the surprise. Oh, now I have to think about this differently again. That's the ongoing gift of the stories.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and I can't help to think with a lot of the Ben Zayden is she's referred to as the goddess of things that flow. And again, there's that kind of the direct correlation with Sarasvati, but water, time, speech, all these things, and you can't help but think of stepping into the river, right? And
back to that.
Yeah,
right?
So is the river, it's something that's constantly changing. I can't think of it. It's the same thing with all of these concepts, right? You
can't step in the same river twice.
Right.
Nope. Yep. No. Maybe. Yeah. Why? No.
Right. That's the beauty of all of philosophy in general, and all of these characters specifically. Is you look at the stories and you look at the all the things behind them, and you say, okay, well, yep, nope. I don't know. Maybe there's something new there each time,
Now, here's something I want to ask you. What do you think? Because we've talked about the flow, we've talked about the river just now, we've talked about all of the things that we've revisited. So what does it really mean that a goddess of knowledge, wisdom, is often represented as goddess of water? What is water? Riddle me this, Batman. What do water and knowledge have in common?
Yeah, again,
wisdom.
I think it's that thing, like when we were talking about saga, right? There's this element, there's kind of a mystical element to it. And, I think that even with all of our science and our technology and how far we've gotten, we're not notably closer to answering the question. What is wisdom or knowledge, right? We can even create artificial intelligences, but when you try to get them to interact like a human, you put them through the Turing test. It's very difficult unless you're in a very narrow, specified field of what you're doing, right? A new thing is they have AI writing news articles, and I can always tell when I'm reading one. Like, oh, okay, well, but no, I think that the message there is the same message as the river, right? They're using that water as a symbolism for knowledge and time and the things that flow. Wisdom and knowledge is not a static thing. You don't just learn it all and then it's there, because even human memory doesn't work that way. Even if you did learn all of the things, your memory, your ability to recall them wouldn't be the same every time.
Right.
It's different every time you recall it. So your entire stream of consciousness and the facts that you're drawing upon, all those things are constantly flowing. They're constantly moving.
Isn't that beautiful? Isn't that great?
Yeah, and these people thousands of years ago knew that. I think that it was something that was identified, inherently.
And now we're in a culture which not always and ever, but two divergent things happen. One is everybody wants to be sure of everything, and nothing is worth anything unless you can be absolutely sure of it, which is totally counter to wisdom in many ways. Or there is no such thing as knowledge. Knowledge is whatever we say it is, and so it becomes relativistic tripe, and you can't possibly glean wisdom from it because you're not willing to sit and do the work to pull it out. And both those things are happening, right?
Yeah, there really is.
The water's not flowing.
Yeah. No, there's a battle between people who are wanting to say, yeah, there's no water. You're either standing on a rock or nothing exists. Which, I mean, those are arguments that we can look at. I'd like to do another series on actual schools of philosophical thought, because I think relativism or nihilistic kind of thought are things that are very interesting and have lessons that can be learned. But I think they're often misunderstood or taken to extremes by people who don't have the background,
Let's do that. That's good.
So we'll get to that someday. But I think at this point, I'm having fun with this series on the different gods. So I'm thinking probably the next most logical one to look at would be gods and goddesses of war.
I was thinking,
probably the next one. So we'll probably end up doing that next time. And until then, keep pondering.